All right, diving right in today, we've got a mountain of research to unpack, all about how humans and the environment interact. Articles, reports, even what looks like a textbook. Wow.
Yeah, it's quite the collection. It really gets into some important questions about understanding our planet and our impact on it, and how we can create a more sustainable future.
Sustainable future, that's the key, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it is a lot to sift through, but that's kind of the whole point of the deep dive, isn't it?
absolutely. We break it down, find those key insights, and help you connect the dots. It's a bit different from just like reading a news article.
Totally. So what's the big picture with all this research? What's the common thread?
Well, the core of it seems to be a study guide for a university course on global environmental issues. And it starts with this idea that, scientists don't actually have all the answers when it comes to environmental change.
Really? Scientists don't have all the answers. Well, that's kind of a relief to hear, to be honest.
It is. But here's the interesting part. The course suggests looking at traditional ecological knowledge, or tech for short, to fill in some of those gaps.
Tech, so like wisdom passed down through generations.
Exactly. Think about indigenous communities who've lived in close relationship with nature for centuries. They have a wealth of knowledge that can be incredibly valuable.
That makes sense. It's like they've been playing the long game of environmental stewardship while, well, the rest of us have been figuring out the rules.
Right.
Pretty amazing.
Right. It's a huge resource. And it seems like this course is trying to bridge that gap, between Western science and tech.
Oh, that's a really fascinating approach. Okay, so we've got interconnected systems and we've got tech as a source of wisdom. Where do we go from there?
Well, next up is human impact, specifically all the things that drive environmental change. And this textbook you gave me, Global Environmental Systems, dives right into population growth.
Makes sense. More people, more demands on the planet, right?
Precisely. And this book really highlights how that exponential growth, just in the last century, has led to incredible pressure on resources. Forests, fisheries, freshwater, fossil fuels, everything.
Yeah, it's like we've been having a massive party on planet Earth, but we forgot to think about the cleanup afterwards. Not the best hosts, huh?
I like that analogy. And it's not just the sheer number of people, it's also how much we consume and the technology we use.
Right. So it's not just how many people are at the party, it's how much they're taking from the buffet
Right.
and what kind of mess their gadgets are making.
Exactly. Like, think about globalization, right? We're all connected through these trade networks, and, well, it's easy to consume things from all over the world without always thinking about the consequences.
So it's like a global buffet where you don't see the whole kitchen. Okay, so this course is asking students to think about their own role in all of this.
Absolutely. It challenges them to examine how even everyday choices, like what they eat, the clothes they buy, how they get around, all contribute to these big global patterns.
Right, because those choices have an impact on those global systems. And what about other factors that might be driving environmental change?
Well, the course materials also highlight the influence of, like, economic and political systems. Wealth and power really shape who benefits from using resources and who ends up dealing with the environmental consequences.
Yeah, so it's not just individual choices, it's the systems that shapes those choices.
Yes, exactly. And the textbook goes into detail about different economic models, from capitalism to socialism, and how they affect the environment. It also looks at the role of governments in setting regulations and promoting sustainable practices.
Okay, so we're getting into some big picture stuff here. Economics, politics, global systems, a lot to unpack for sure.
It is, but I think the course does a good job of showing how all these pieces connect.
Okay, so we've got the foundational knowledge, we've explored the drivers of change. Where does the deep dives go next?
Next up is sustainable development finding solutions.
Okay, solutions. Sustainable development, we hear that phrase all the time, but what does it actually mean?
The textbook defines it as, and I'm quoting here, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs.
So basically, finding a way to thrive
Yeah.
without, trashing the planet for our kids and grandkids.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Exactly. It requires a pretty big shift in our thinking, moving away from short-term gains and towards long-term well-being.
Okay, that sounds great in theory, but how do we actually make that happen?
Well, this study unit looks at a bunch of approaches: technological innovations, policy changes, individual actions. It's all in there.
Okay, let's break that down a bit. What kind of technological innovations could help us move towards a more sustainable future?
The book points to renewable energy technologies like solar, wind, geothermal as a crucial part of getting off fossil fuels. It also talks about advances in energy efficiency, sustainable agriculture, and waste management.
So technology is definitely a big part of the solution toolkit.
For sure. But the course emphasizes that it's not a magic fix. Technology needs to go hand in hand with policy changes. We need the right incentives to encourage sustainable practices and, well, discourage harmful ones.
Right, so we need the rules of the game to be in line with our sustainability goals. What kind of policy changes are we talking about here?
Well, things like carbon taxes, cap and trade systems, subsidies for renewable energy, and regulations on pollution and deforestation.
Okay, so those are the big picture solutions. But what about us regular folks? What role do we play in all of this?
Well, individual actions matter. Even small changes in our daily lives can add up. What we eat, what we buy, how we get around, it all makes a difference.
So it's not just about waiting for governments or corporations to fix everything. It's about taking responsibility ourselves, right?
Exactly. And the course encourages students to think about how they can become agents of change in their own communities, advocating for sustainable practices, supporting local businesses, and educating others.
Okay, that feels empowering.
Right.
So we've got technology, policy, and individual action all working together.
That's the idea. And the deep dive continues from here, exploring specific environmental issues in more detail. But first, let's take a quick break. And we're back for part 2 of our deep dive. Last time, we waded through a ton of course material on global environmental issues, everything from Earth's systems to those drivers of change like, population growth and all that.
Yeah, it was a lot. I'm still processing, honestly.
Yeah.
But it was fascinating to see how connected everything is, right? Like climate, water, biodiversity, human activity. It's all part of the same web.
Absolutely. And we talked about how valuable traditional ecological knowledge, tech, can be in finding solutions. It often complements Western science in really interesting ways.
Yeah, it's like a whole different way of looking at the world, right?
Yeah.
So for this part, we're going to get a little more into the real-world applications of all this.
You bet. This next study unit in the course dives into some specific global water issues, starting with deforestation in the tropics, those lush rainforests.
Okay, deforestation. We've all seen the pictures, those heartbreaking images of rainforests being cleared. But the course material seems to go beyond just the visuals, right?
Right. The textbook, Global Environmental Systems, looks at deforestation as this really complex issue with consequences that go way beyond just the trees themselves.
So it's not just about losing trees, it's about the impact on biodiversity, climate change, and even those local communities who depend on the forests.
Exactly. And one of the articles you sent actually uses a case study of the Amazon rainforest in Brazil to illustrate this.
Oh yeah, I remember that one. It was pretty grim.
It is. It shows how clearing those vast areas, for agriculture, logging, mining, all of that, has led to huge biodiversity loss. Plus, it's messing with the carbon cycle and even changing rainfall patterns.
The article even mentions savannization, where the rainforest turns into savanna.
Yeah, it's a pretty scary thought. And the course materials really emphasize how deforestation is not just a local problem, it affects the whole planet's climate.
Wow, so those trees aren't just beautiful, they're crucial for keeping the whole system in balance.
Right. It's like we're messing with the planet's lungs. The course material does offer some potential solutions, though. Things like sustainable forestry, protected areas, and involving local communities in forest management.
So it's not just about saying, stop cutting down trees, it's about finding smarter ways to manage those forests.
Right. And that leads nicely into the next topic, which moves us from those lush rainforests to the dry lands. This section focuses on desertification.
Desertification, where fertile land turns into desert. That sounds pretty intense.
It is a serious issue, for sure. And one thing I found interesting in the course material is how it points out that desertification isn't always just about human activities. Climate variability plays a role, too.
So it's not just overgrazing or bad land management practices. Climate change is a factor, too.
Absolutely. The textbook even uses the Sahel region in Africa as an example, where those prolonged droughts have really contributed to desertification.
Oh, yeah, and that has knock-on effects, right? Like poverty and food insecurity get even worse because of that land degradation.
Oh, for sure. The course materials also brought up something called biospheres, which I thought was fascinating.
Biospheres. What are those?
They're these halos of bare soil you see around watering holes in dry lands.
Oh, I've seen pictures of that.
Yeah.
I never knew there was a name for it.
Right. It's actually a good example of how even something as simple as, like, where animals gather to drink can have a big impact?
How so?
Well, all those animals concentrated in one spot can overgraze and compact the soil, which then contributes to desertification. So it's like a vicious cycle.
Yeah, it makes sense. So it's not just about fixing human behavior. It's about understanding the whole system, how climate and human actions interact.
Exactly. And the course emphasizes that we need to address desertification on multiple fronts, promoting sustainable land management, restoring ecosystems, finding alternative livelihoods for people affected by desertification.
Okay, so it's complex, like all these environmental problems seem to be. It seems like there's a common thread here. We can't solve these problems in isolation. They're all connected.
You got it. And speaking of interconnectedness, our next stop takes us to the oceans.
Oceans, yeah, they cover most of the planet, but we don't always think about how important they are. What's the course material saying about ocean health?
Well, one of the first issues it tackles is overfishing, which has really decimated fish populations around the world.
Yeah, we hear about that a lot. It seems like we're taking way too much from the oceans.
Right. The course actually uses the collapse of the cod fishery off the coast of Newfoundland back in the 90s as an example.
Oh, yeah, I remember hearing about that. It was a huge deal, wasn't it?
It was. It devastated the local economy and had major social impacts. It's a pretty stark reminder that even a resource as vast as the ocean can be overexploited.
Yeah, we can't just assume the oceans will keep providing forever if we don't manage them properly.
That's the message. And the course material explores ways to make fishing more sustainable. Things like catch limits, marine protected areas, promoting responsible fishing practices.
Okay, so it's about figuring out how to fish without, emptying the ocean.
Exactly. And beyond overfishing, there's also the problem of pollution, especially plastic pollution. It's pretty much everywhere in the oceans now.
Yeah, it's hard to miss those images of sea turtles tangled in plastic or birds with stomachs full of plastic bits. It's disturbing.
It is. And the course gets into the effects of all that plastic on marine life, from entanglement and ingestion to how it messes up food chains and even helps invasive species spread.
It seems like it's pretty much impossible to avoid plastic these days.
It's a huge problem, and the course even mentions microplastics, those tiny little bits that are basically everywhere now, even in the deepest parts of the ocean.
Microplastics. So, even if we stopped using plastic bags and straws right now, the problem's not going away.
Not immediately, no. These microplastics end up in marine animals, which could eventually make their way up the food chain, even onto our plates.
That's kind of freaky.
It is. The course suggests a multi-pronged approach to dealing with this: reducing consumption, improving waste management, finding biodegradable alternatives, and cleaning up existing plastic in the ocean.
So it's a combination of individual actions, better policies, and new technologies.
Exactly. And speaking of connections, the course material then takes us back to freshwater resources, focusing on the impact of dams.
Okay, dams. They're usually seen as good things, right? Hydroelectric power, flood control, irrigation, all that.
Right, but they can have a downside too. The textbook really digs into the negative impacts of dams on river ecosystems.
Really? How so?
Well, dams change the natural flow of rivers, messing with water temperature, how sediment moves, and even fish migration patterns. Plus, they can displace communities and flood valuable ecosystems.
The course specifically mentioned the Three Gorges Dam in China, right?
Yeah, it's the biggest one in the world. It generates clean energy and helps control flooding, but it also displaced a ton of people and flooded some important cultural sites.
So another example of those unintended consequences. Sometimes those big engineering projects come with hidden costs.
Definitely. The course really encourages thinking about how to balance those benefits and costs, finding ways to manage water resources that work for both people and the environment.
Right, so finding a more balanced approach.
And to make it even more relatable, the course brings things closer to home with the issue of urban water pollution.
Okay, urban water pollution. I'm guessing human activity is the main culprit here, too.
You guessed it. The textbook paints a pretty depressing picture of rivers and streams in cities, often choked with industrial waste, sewage, and stormwater runoff.
Yikes, so we're basically turning our waterways into open sewers.
It's a harsh image, but unfortunately it's true in many places. And the course explores the risks to human health from that polluted water, as well as the damage it does to aquatic life.
Yeah, I read that article you sent about the Ganges River in India. That was a tough one.
Yeah, that's a tragic example. It's considered one of the most polluted rivers in the world, with a mix of industrial waste, untreated sewage, agricultural runoff, and even religious practices adding to the problem.
So it's not just a technical problem, it's also cultural and religious.
Exactly. And the course emphasizes that solving urban water pollution requires a multi-pronged approach. Stricter regulations, investments in wastewater treatment, better urban planning, even community engagement to change behaviors.
Okay, so it's another one of those complex problems where we need to look at the whole picture to find a solution.
Absolutely. And with that, we've reached the end of our deep dive into global water issues.
Back again for part 3. That last part really got me thinking about all the ways our actions impact water, from those deforested landscapes to the plastic swirling around in the ocean. It's a lot to take in.
It is, yeah. But it's also really fascinating to see how interconnected everything is, right? Like,
Mm.
we can't just address one issue without considering the others.
Makes sense. So where are we headed next in this deep dive? What's the course material focusing on now?
Well, sticking with the essentials, this next study unit dives into food, specifically how agriculture, food security, and the environment are all intertwined.
Okay, food, definitely essential.
Hmm.
But the course material seems to be suggesting that our modern ways of producing food, might not be so great for the planet.
Yeah, you're right. The textbook, Global Environmental Systems, gets into the downsides of those intensive farming practices that are so common these days.
Intensive farming, that's all about maximizing food production, right? Getting the most out of every acre.
Exactly. And while it's been successful in boosting yields, it's come with some pretty serious environmental consequences. The course highlights things like soil degradation, water pollution, biodiversity loss, even climate change, all linked to those intensive practices.
So it's like we're winning the food production game, but losing the environmental sustainability game.
That's a good way to put it. And one of the main culprits, according to the course, is our heavy reliance on chemical fertilizers and pesticides.
I mean, those are supposed to help us grow more food, right? What's the problem with them?
Well, it creates this sort of vicious cycle. See, those chemicals can actually degrade soil health, making it more prone to erosion and nutrient loss.
Okay, so the soil gets weaker, less fertile.
Right. And then, to compensate, farmers have to use even more fertilizers to maintain those yields. But then the excess fertilizer runs off into waterways, causing pollution and all sorts of problems.
So we're kind of hooked on these chemicals, but they're ultimately undermining the very thing we need to grow food in the first place, healthy soil.
Exactly. So the course explores alternative approaches to agriculture that try to break free from that chemical dependency.
Okay, let's talk solutions. What are some ways to produce food more sustainably? I've heard a lot about organic farming lately.
Yeah, organic farming is definitely getting more popular. It focuses on natural pest control and building soil fertility without using synthetic chemicals.
I mean, organic food seems great, but does it really work on a large scale?
That's one of the debates, for sure. Critics of organic farming argue that it's less efficient and requires more land to produce the same amount of food. And if we need more land, well, that could lead to deforestation.
So it's a trade-off,
Right.
potentially. Higher yields versus a lighter environmental footprint. Tough choices.
Yeah, it's complicated. And the course really encourages students to think about these complex trade-offs, balancing food production, environmental concerns, and making sure everyone has access to food.
One of the articles you shared mentioned something called agroecology, which sounded interesting.
Oh, yeah. Agroecology takes a more holistic approach. It draws on ecological principles and traditional knowledge to create farming systems that work with nature, not against it.
So less about forcing nature to do what we want and more about cooperating with it.
Exactly. Agroecology focuses on things like crop diversity, natural pest control, building healthy soil. It's all about creating a resilient system that can handle challenges.
It's like instead of trying to control nature, we're learning from it.
Exactly. And the course presents agroecology as a promising solution, for reducing those chemical inputs, promoting biodiversity, even making our food systems more resilient to climate change.
It's a lot of wins. Are there other solutions being explored?
Well, there's also precision agriculture, which uses technology to optimize crop management and reduce waste.
Okay, so we're talking high-tech farming.
Yeah.
Sensors and drones and data analysis, that sort of thing.
You got it. Precision agriculture helps farmers use water and fertilizer more efficiently, cut down on pesticides, and even predict and manage pest outbreaks.
Wow, sounds pretty futuristic. But technology isn't always a perfect fix, right?
That's true. The course emphasizes the importance of using technology responsibly and making sure it benefits everyone, not just large-scale farms.
Speaking of complex issues, we can't talk about food production without mentioning GMOs. What's the course material say about genetically modified organisms?
GMOs are definitely a hot topic. The course presents them as a mixed bag, really, with potential benefits and risks to consider.
Okay, break it down for me. What are the arguments on each side?
Well, supporters of GMOs point out that they can lead to higher crop yields, less reliance on pesticides, and even more nutritious food.
So they're like super crops.
Some people see them that way, yeah. But critics worry about the potential environmental impacts, like creating herbicide-resistant weeds or reducing biodiversity.
Yeah, I can see how that could be a problem.
Right. And there are also concerns about corporate control of the food system and the possibility of, unintended consequences down the line.
So it's another one of those situations where we need to weigh the potential benefits and risks carefully.
Exactly. And it's not just about the technology itself, it's about how we use it and what kind of food system we want to create.
Right. We have to think about the big picture. And speaking of the big picture, the course also gets into the issue of food security, making sure everyone has enough to eat.
Absolutely. And it explores the factors that influence access to food, everything from poverty and inequality to conflicts and climate change.
Right, because it's not just about producing enough food, it's about making sure it reaches the people who need it.
Exactly. And the course highlights a whole range of strategies to address food insecurity, promoting sustainable agriculture, strengthening local food systems, tackling poverty and inequality, building resilience to climate change. It's a multifaceted approach.
Yeah, food security is definitely connected to all these other issues we've been talking about.
Right. It all comes back to that idea of interconnectedness.
So after exploring the world of food, where does our deep dive take us next?
Well, next up is energy, another one of those essential elements of modern life.
Energy. Yeah, it powers our homes, our transportation, our industries, but it's also a major source of environmental problems, right? I mean, we can't talk about climate change without talking about energy.
Exactly. And this study unit really digs into the complexities of our energy choices, exploring the pros and cons of different sources, from those traditional fossil fuels to all the new renewable options.
Okay, let's start with those fossil fuels. Coal, oil, natural gas. We know they're bad for the environment, but they're still the go-to for a lot of the world. Why haven't we moved away from them completely?
It's complicated. The textbook points out that they're still abundant, relatively cheap to extract, and, well, we've built a whole system around them.
It's like we've been playing this fossil fuel game for so long that it's hard to switch to something else.
That's a good way to put it. But the course makes it very clear that transitioning away from fossil fuels is essential if we want to avoid the worst impacts of climate change.
Okay, so that brings us to renewables. Solar, wind, geothermal, hydropower, all those good things. Are those the solution to our energy dilemma?
They have huge potential. The course materials definitely emphasize that. They're clean, they're renewable, and they're becoming more cost competitive all the time.
So what's stopping us from going all in on renewables?
Well, there's still some challenges. For one thing, most renewable sources are intermittent, meaning their output depends on things like the weather. So we need better ways to store energy for when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. And then there's the whole issue of infrastructure. We need to build new transmission lines and update our energy grids to accommodate more renewable sources.
Right, so it's not just about flipping a switch. It's a pretty massive undertaking. But it sounds like the course material suggests it's a transition we need to make.
Absolutely. And it explores ways to make that transition smoother through policies that incentivize renewable energy development and technologies that can overcome those storage and infrastructure challenges.
Okay, we've got fossil fuels and renewables. What about nuclear power? Where does that fit in?
Nuclear is a tough one. It's a low-carbon source, so it could help with climate change. But there are concerns about safety, waste disposal, and the possibility of, nuclear weapons proliferation.
Right, so it's a high-stakes bet with potential benefits and risks that need to be weighed carefully.
Exactly. The course presents nuclear as a complex issue, and it encourages students to think critically about its role in a sustainable energy future.
Okay, so we've got fossil fuels, renewables, and nuclear on the table. What else does the course cover in terms of energy?
It also talks a lot about energy efficiency, which is all about using less energy to get the same results.
Right, so it's not just about where our energy comes from, but also about how we use it.
Exactly. And the course highlights all sorts of ways to improve energy efficiency, like better building design, more efficient appliances, and making our transportation systems less energy intensive.
So it's about doing more with less.
Precisely. And often, it's the most cost-effective way to reduce our energy consumption and lower our environmental impact.
Well, this deep dive into the course material has really opened my eyes to the complexities of our energy system and the choices we have to make.
Me too. And now, to wrap things up, we're going to zoom out and consider the ethical dimension of all these environmental challenges.
Okay, back to environmental ethics. We touched on this briefly before. What are those key questions we need to be asking ourselves?
Environmental ethics really gets at the heart of our relationship with the natural world. It asks questions like, what is the value of nature? Do we have a duty to protect the environment? How do we balance human needs with the needs of other species?
Big questions indeed.
They are, and there are lots of different perspectives on these issues. Some people believe that nature has intrinsic value, meaning it's valuable in and of itself, regardless of whether it's useful to humans.
So like a tree has value even if we don't use it for lumber or shade.
Exactly. Others take a more human-centered view, arguing that nature's value lies in its usefulness to us.
So we should protect the environment because it provides us with clean air, water, resources, all that good stuff.
Exactly. And of course, there are many shades of gray between those two perspectives.
Right, it's not always so black and white. But how does this all play out in the real world? How do our ethical beliefs actually influence our actions?
Our beliefs about nature shape how we interact with the environment, the choices we make, the policies we support. If we believe nature has inherent value, we're more likely to push for its protection, even if it means making some sacrifices.
It's like our ethical compass guides our actions in this big global casino we're all playing in.
Well said. And that's really what this course seems to be all about, encouraging students to think critically about their own values and how they connect to the choices they make.
It's not just about learning facts. It's about becoming more conscious and responsible citizens of the planet.
Exactly. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into this fascinating course material.
Wow, what a journey. We've covered so much ground, from the basics of Earth systems to the complexities of water, food, energy, and even delved into the philosophical realm of environmental ethics. It's been a real whirlwind of information.
It has. And hopefully you, dear listener, have come away with a deeper appreciation for the interconnectedness of all things and the importance of those sustainable choices we make each and every day.
Absolutely. The future of our planet really depends on it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.